Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Quinn, and I'm a bookseller here at Women and Children First Bookstore. Thank you so much for joining us tonight to celebrate the release of The Hurting Kind. We begin our virtual events as we begin our events in store with a land acknowledgement. Please join me in acknowledging that the land on which the bookstore stands is the occupied, unceded territory of the Peoria, Potawatomi, and Miami people. There are over 75,000 Indigenous people living here in Illinois, and we strive to recognize and honor Native literature and communities. Please stay tuned for more events like this one. I'm very excited for a virtual event we will be hosting on May 23rd. We'll be celebrating the release of Dorothy Parker's new book, Torn Apart. She'll be in conversation with Eve L. Ewing, so look out for that. If you're in Chicago, our bookstore is reopened Tuesday through Sunday, and we ship anywhere in the U.S. You can order from us at womenandchildrenfirst.com. During this event, you can ask the panelists questions anytime using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And if you haven't already, you can purchase this book from Women and Children First by clicking the link that I'll put in the chat for you. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ada Limón, who is the author of The Hurting Kind, as well as 5 other collections of poems. These include, most recently, The Carrying, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award and was named a finalist for the Penn Jeans Stein Book Award. And Rebecca Lindenberg, who is the author of Love and Index and the Logan Notebooks, which was a winner of the 2015 Utah Book Award. Thanks so much for joining us. Take it away.
Thank you so much for having us here. I love all the greetings in there. This is so wonderful. It's such a pleasure to do this event and be in the virtual world with one of my dearest friends and one of my favorite poets, Rebecca Lindenberg. And I actually, this book has only been out for 8 days and it feels like it's already has this life. It's so amazing. And so I just really want to begin with this gratitude for Women and Children First, the bookstore, the mission, the legacy of that store, for making this all happen, and to Rebecca for being here with me tonight. And I have asked, because Rebecca is truly one of my favorite poets, if she would begin with a poem that she has written to share with us. And then I'll read some poems and then we'll just start a conversation. But I always feel like, why would I not listen to a poem when I could have the chance to listen to a wonderful poem? So, Rebecca.
Thank you, Ada. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation with you. I'm incredibly excited to talk about this book, which I think is my favorite of all of your books so far, which my mind just keeps getting better and better and more ambitious and interesting. And I have so many questions, but I'm really grateful to you for inviting me to read a poem. So I'm going to read something that is relatively new. I've been diabetic for over 35 years, which you know, but I always sort of wrote to escape that fact. And during the pandemic, that became an even more inescapable fact. And so I started writing about it a little bit. So I'm going to read one of those poems. So this is called Chronic Disease Imagined as a Haunting. Origin of most my chaos, ghost, tethered to my body many times over, like a giant balloon from the Thanksgiving Day parades. Sometimes it pulls like a dog that knows it's close to home, sometimes like a parachute deployed in a convertible. Since 11 years of age, constant daily annoyances. It's forever stalling or else speeding up the clocks, fucking with my sense of time. The way 10 minutes means something different if you're furrowed over a new recipe for bechamel or waiting for the ambulance. It does little things that Dementor-esque siphon off the life force. Middle of the night, it shakes me awake from the inside, or because I'm hurrying to a first day of teaching, it'll hide all my test strips, knowing that I cannot go without. like a poltergeist who steals the ace from a full deck of cards just to make it useless. My ghost has 1,000 ways to ruin all the fun. No cake at the wedding, no beer on the brewery tour, and a minuscule crack in my insulin pump lets just a tear's worth of seawater in, so it fails while we're snorkeling in Key West. It keeps beeping on a boat full of sun-honeyed tourists wondering, what is that noise? Can't have any of the tropical fruit plattered out in concentric crescents. Can't get back to land to fix this any faster than the captain is willing to go. All the things you do to appease it, not leaving a heel of bread on a sill or passing the videotape along, but pricking my finger to draw a seed of blood planted on a test strip. Sometimes I leave these around for my ghost to find. I consult with the doctors who advise me in my rituals, suggest I walk daily around the house 5 times or swallow some new tablet. Still, the ever-present sense of threat, that it's loosening the blades of the ceiling fan thumping in my chest, doing its best to imbalance the bookshelf of my hormones I'll one day be found pinned under. Or it might push me down the staircase of a low blood sugar and I'll end up ragdolled at the bottom. Knowing it's hell-bent on my betrayal, I recite my lists of ways that I might die, which I'm always working on, so I can ghost-proof against them. Could it fuck with the caulk, cause a leak, moisten a joist so my bathtub-shaped kidney falls? That kind of insipid long-term shit is just its style. To anticipate it, I have detectors everywhere. Smoke, yes, and carbon monoxide like everyone, but also devices bespoke to my harassment. A device to measure the rise and fall of sugars in the blood, another to deliver life-saving potion that keeps the ghost in the blood quiet, still another that just makes the sound of a woman's voice if I haven't spoken for a while, so I can haunt it back. After all these years, I don't know. Sometimes I wonder who I'd be without it. Thank you.
Oh, that was gorgeous. I'm so glad you're exploring this subject in your work. I can't wait for the manuscript that you are going to send me. Thank you. That was beautiful and moving and important, because I think we don't talk enough about chronic illness, because I feel like there's a lot of, because people get bored with it, right? They get bored with it.
It's I have a poem about that.
And so I just, I feel like, especially in this space that is so feminist and is so clearly oriented to the health and safety of women, I think it's important to bring that in. So I love that. You know, I was going to read a different poem, but of course, as this happens, it sort of put me in the mood for this poem. And this is a poem I wrote for my stepfather. And I'm just going to read, those of you in the audience, thank you again for being here. I'm just going to read 3 poems from The Hurting Kind, and then we'll chat a little bit. And then I'll probably, Rebecca may ask me to read some more as we go, and we'll just have a discussion. This is a poem I wrote for my stepfather. And yeah, I think it dovetails nicely with that beautiful poem Rebecca just read. A good story. Some days, dishes piled in the sink, books littering the coffee table are harder than others. Today, my head is packed with cockroaches, dizziness, and everywhere it hurts, venom in the jaw, behind the eyes, between the blades. Still, the dog is snoring on my right, the cat on my left. Outside, all those redbuds are just getting good. I tell a friend, the body is so body, and she nods. I used to like the darkest story, the bleak snippets someone would toss out about just how bad it could get. My stepfather told me a story about when he lived on the streets as a kid, how he'd, some nights, sleep under the grill at a fast food restaurant until both he and his buddy got fired. I used to like that story for some reason, something in me that believed in overcoming. But right now, all I want is a story about human kindness. The way once, when I couldn't stop crying because I was 15 and heartbroken, he came in and made me eat a small pizza he'd cut up into tiny bites until the tears stopped. Maybe I was just hungry, I said, and he nodded, holding out the last piece. I was just, of course, it made me think of the significance of how we flourish, who makes us flourish. And then I think I'll read this poem called Banished Wonders, which I know as we continue on through the pandemic and the ebb and the flows of, you know, surges here and mellowing here and all of these things, this poem keeps coming back to me. Banished Wonders. The American linden sways, nonplussed by the storm. A bounce here, a shimmy there, just shaking like music, left over from the night's end, wafting into the avenues before sleep. I remember once walking down Clinton Street and singing that line returning, New York is cold, but I like where I'm living. There's music on Clinton Street all through the evening. And of course, there was music, though it was me and my incessant remembering. And here now, what does one even offer? Darling cockroaches of the highest order, hard under things of hard under worlds, I am utterly suspicious of advice. What is the world like out there? Are you singing in the tunnels? I should say nothing sometimes. I should say memory will leap from the mountain. Dearest purple spiderwort in the ditch's mud, how did you do it? Such bravery, such softness, even with all that name-calling and rage. No one wants to be the pretty thing all the time, but no one wants to be the weed. Alone in an Argentina at a cafe, I never felt like dancing. I screwed my face up so it said nothing and no one and never. Borges lost his sight over years, and yet sometimes it is best to be invisible. What is it to be seen in the right way, as who you are, a flash of color, a blur in the crowd, something spectacular but untouchable? And now the world is gone. No more Buenos Aires, no Santiago, no tango, no samba, no more pisco sour, sweet and sticky and piercing the head's stubborn brick. Mistral writes, we don't need all the things that used to give us pleasure. Still some dense desire to sneak into the cities of the world again. A window, to sit at Cafe Tortoni and refuse an invitation because I can. Now we endure time, this envenomed veil of extremes, loss and grief and reckoning. Mistral writes, I killed a woman in me, one I did not love. But I do not want to kill that longing woman in me. I love her, and I want her to go on longing until it drives her mad, and longing until her desire is something like a blazing flower, a tree shaking off the torrents of rain, as if it was simply making music.
So good.
I thought about you because I saw Elizabeth Kendall here, and I was thinking about our trips together in Queens, Latin America, you and I in Santiago.
Mm-hmm.
And then I thought I would read this poem, which you and I talked about on the phone yesterday. Was that just yesterday?
Yes.
Eons ago. You guys, I had a nap and I am so much better. Turns out I really needed a nap. This is a prose poem, and this is, yeah, I'll just say it's about birds, and then it takes a swerve, I guess. Calling things what they are. I pass the feeder and yell, grackle party. And then an hour later, I yell, morning dove after party. I call the feeder the party and the seed on the ground the after party. I'm getting so good at watching that I've even dug out the binoculars an old poet gave me back when I was young and heading to the Cape with so much future ahead of me, it was like my own ocean. Tufted titmouse, I yell, and Lucas laughs and says, thought so. But he's humoring me. He didn't think so at all. My father does the same thing, shouts out at the feeder, announcing the party, the party attendees. He throws out a whole peanut or two to the Stellar's jay who visits on a low oak branch in the morning. To think there was a time I thought birds were kind of boring. Brown bird, gray bird, black bird, blah, blah, blah bird. Then I started to learn their names by the ocean, and the person I was dating said, that's the problem with you, Limón. You're all fauna and no flora. And I began to learn the names of trees. I like to call things as they are. Before, the only thing I was interested in was love, how it grips you, how it terrifies you, how it annihilates and resuscitates you. I didn't know then that it wasn't even love that I was interested in, but my own suffering. I thought suffering kept things interesting. How funny that I called it love, and the whole time it was pain.
Get out of here with that poem. You know what I love about that poem so much is it gets right. It is, to me, almost a perfect example of an Ada Limón poem. It has humor, it has intimacy, but in the end, it's just, like right for the soft spot. It's just, it goes right for the heart, and it's perfect. It's so fantastic. In fact, I'm gonna make a request already.
Yeah.
I would love to have you read for us the poem that comes right before that one.
Yeah.
Because they feel like companion pieces to me in a way, and they're both so stunning. So stunning.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, this is a lizard poem. It's a poem. Do I want to say anything about it?
Just read it.
I'm just going to read it. It's not a prose poem. It's in couplets. Only the faintest blue. Somewhere in the haunted desert, I hitched my callow life to a man who thought I hadn't suffered enough. He might have said that very thing. You haven't suffered enough. Young whiptail lizards lined the cottonwood path, so the river where I walked each day to remember who I was. She who had not suffered. My hands tanned in the green sage air. I walked until I was softer, until clouds, until I could tame my colors and go back and cook a lazy dinner. Once he insisted I ride home with a friend who was clearly drunk, so he could make a call he didn't want me to hear. An ex, a lawyer, a dealer, I don't know. I knew I didn't like his friend, who drove too fast after shots of tequila. At the roadside Mexican dive with fake spike cacti in the foyer like stage props. Maybe this is suffering, I thought. Am I suffering now? Or now? I felt most myself by the river. Vast sorrel river, ready to flood or tear down everything in its way, hard to cross, rapid and legendary, the color of the earth. I did not want to throw myself in. Instead, I'd watch the whiptails skitter in the dust. Sisters of the small, quiet pleasure of edges and disappearing to safety. I can still hear that river in my mind. My teacher can still remember the day I left him, the arguing, the fight where I kept my head down and packed like fury was a new, smart skill. But mostly, I remember the flitting of lizards, how they had felt like kinship, how later I read that the New Mexico whiptail is an all-female species, reproducing by parthenogenesis, asexual and yet genetically diverse. Yellow lines run the length of their gray bodies, and vibrant blue-green tails when they're young. And as they age, their scales, their whole body changes until only the faintest blue remains. And safer now, they become the earthen color of the river.
Oh, I love that poem so much. But I do, those two poems, they feel like they orbit each other.
Definitely.
That has to do with sort of coming of age. It's like sort of there's like an innocence and experience, kind of thing happening between those two poems. I love the sort of triumph of their positioning in the book, where you see the writer grappling with like empowering herself, and then in the next poem, this like wisdom that has kind of dawned upon her sort of shows up as almost a surprise. I think it's so fantastic. I love it. I love it.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I thought we could start by just having a conversation that sort of went from like the macro of the book, especially for some of our audience members who haven't had a chance to read it yet.
Yeah.
And then kind of pulls it into some of the individual poems. And, the book is structured by the seasons, right? It begins spring, and then summer, and then fall, and then winter are the 4 sections of the book, which of course gives it this like cycles of life vibe, but it also gives it a kind of mythic almost quality, that sort of Persephone, like thematic, I guess, kind of through the book. But I also wondered, did that have like, how were you conceiving of that when you were putting it together?
Yeah.
Do you have ideas about the ways that the books within, that the poems within each season speak to each other? Does it have anything to do with like the time of year when they were written, or the order in which they were written? Or, if you could just talk about because it's so elemental and yet so interesting. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about putting this together as a book.
Yeah, I love that question. I can be totally honest that when I was really sort of confounded in how this book was going to come together in terms of its organization, and that usually doesn't happen to me. I really love, as you know, I love putting together and organizing manuscripts. It's my favorite part. I have, for me, it's actually really fun to do. It's not intimidating. It's just like, oh, this is the next fun part. And this one was hard. And I think what happened was I realized that a lot of the poems are really offerings to other people or animals or their observance. And I felt like there was, even though there's this narrative eye, of course, and the speaker is there and it's me, I did feel like there needed to be something that felt like it was ongoing and I was a part of, but I wasn't making it happen. I wasn't making the sections happen. This was happening, right? So it was a way of decentering the self. And it was also a way of allowing an ongoingness, a sense of ongoingness to the world itself, that I am a part of it and I'm hitched to it, but I am not the center of it. And I am not making the earth spin. Instead I'm watching it happen. I'm watching it unfold. And that was really important to me, because the 3 books that have come before it, the whole 5 books that have come before it, did have somewhat of a narrative arc. And so I kept looking to see if that was there. And when I realized that I needed to remove myself from the ordering, the book came together. So there are poems that have been written, you know, that were written in the fall that are in a summer section or whatever. So sometimes there was an emotion or feeling, or I thought, oh, this has to be a summer poem. And then there are times where a spring poem will be in a winter poem because I needed there to be in the winter section, because I needed there to be some sort of life in the winter section that memory provides us. So yeah, so it was for me, it was, I mean, I remember the very moment I was sitting at my desk and I was like, oh, it's seasons. And it just hit me. And I thought, that's the book. That's how I make the book.
I love that. It works so well. So first of all, can I just go back to the idea of the poem as like an offering, like the people and the creatures and the world in which, you know, the poems are taking place? Because one of the things, so, you know, these poems to me, they share a lot with the poems from like The Carrying and Bright Dead Things for sure. And like I said, the earlier poems, but those two books in particular, which are also, you know, very animate, like they sort of teem with life. One of the things I love about your poems is that everything has agency in this like really beautiful way. You give so much, you know, animus to everything that shows up in your poems. It feels like an offering. So it's really interesting to hear you like frame it that way, actually. But one of the things that I think is really compelling about these poems is the way that, in a very philosophical way, I think the poems kind of investigate the operations of witness. You know, it's like, what am I witnessing? What is the purpose of witnessing? Who is it for?
Yeah.
What is it doing? Can it be invasive or like kind of a problem? Can it be like a problem?
Yeah.
And so like one of the poems, if you don't mind reading it for us, where I think it's kind of interesting, there are several of them, but could you read the poem Sanctuary from the spring section?
Yeah, you know, I was thinking lots about the idea of how we often make ourselves the hero of our own poems, right? And our own lives, for that matter. And how a lot of times when I'm feeling untethered and sort of at risk for spiraling either up or down, spiraling either one direction, that remembering that I am not at the center and remembering that I am part of something larger and that I'm also being watched and being a part of something, right? Like that the tree means something to me, but I mean something to the tree too. And that there's a reciprocal relationship. And that was a big part of the last, 5 years of putting together the book. And so I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think when I think about the offering, it's also like, it's the give and take. And I think I think this is the first book, at least for me, that does that on a larger scale all the way through.
Yeah, it's so compelling. It recurs like throughout the book, this sort of, it reminds me a little bit of the romantic poet John Keats, who was like, I want to be nobody.
Yeah. Right.
So anyway, please read.
Yeah. Okay. Sanctuary. Suppose it's easy to slip into another's green skin, bury yourself in leaves, and wait for a breaking open, a breaking out. I have, before, been tricked into believing I could be both an eye and the world. The great eye of the world is both gaze and gloss, to be swallowed by being seen, a dream, to be made whole by being not a witness, but witnessed.
So good. That's such an interesting idea too, having like the world look back at you, but also disappearing into it, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's like an act of self-erasure sometimes, like we use the phrase like lose oneself in something, right? Yeah. but to think of that as a sanctuary, I think is so beautiful and so wise. Like there's so much wisdom in these poems, Ada. Like it's so over and over again. As I was reading the book, I found myself like making my church noises. I was like, oh. So yeah. So like along those lines, then, like one of the things you and I have talked about with your poems is the way that your speaker is constantly revisiting the like semi-permeable membrane between the person and the world that they're moving around in. And, so there are so many poems here. I mean, even the ones you've read to us already, where there's so like the speaker kind of learns from the river and kind of like learns from, falls in love with the lizards. And I mean, there are all of these ways in which the flora and the fauna of the book are like passing through the speaker, but the speaker is also, of course, like passing through their world and kind of entering into and passing through their world and changing it, right? And changing their world. And so like one of the interesting things I think about this book too, that it feels like the other books are getting at it, but it happens in a crystallized way in this book, is like when the speaker admits to like violent interventions in the world that she's moving through. I have a poem in mind. I just have at least one poem in mind that like maybe would speak to that, but I wondered if you wanted to like chit chat about it a little bit first.
Yeah, no, I love that, because I feel like one of the things that, as I was putting together the book and going through it, I kept thinking, is it too much to ask people to follow me through this own sort of journey of almost dissolving the self and really feel and letting myself feel. And then it was when the title came, because I kept thinking the book is done, and is it done? And then, as you know, I struggled with the title a lot, and there's a titular poem called The Hurting Kind, which it took me almost 3 years to finish. And it was my husband, Lucas, who said, like, I think that's the title. And I was really struggling with putting the word hurt in the title, because it's such a heavy word. But then I kept thinking about all the ways in which, we aren't allowed to show hurt, and we aren't allowed to be hurt, and there's always this sort of celebration of stoicism and celebration of courage and bravery, and a word that I'm getting more and more sick of, resilience. Even though like I want resilience, I'm like, oh, do I really need to still be resilient? And I'm sure so many people feel that way. And so I think that part of it was like, how do I acknowledge the importance of grief, the importance of feeling, the importance of, to use your word, like being permeable to the world and to be receptive, and to not always think, no, this is my compartment in my human body, my human mind, and I move through the world in a way that will make my human life flourish, period. And I was trying to sort of get away from some of those old stories or narratives that for me stopped making sense to me.
Yeah.
And so I just started to question everything. And maybe it's been, that, and I think that's part of maturing for me as a poet and as a person, is really starting to question what has been given to me as instructions, right? Of like, oh no, this is who you are, or this is, and I'm very curious, like, no, I don't think that is, or like, oh, you're so brave to do this, or you're so, and I think there was something in that I really wanted to challenge. And in that challenging, I think I started to discover new things about myself and my own appreciation and awe and wonder of the world. And in some ways, the acknowledgement of grief and hurt and longing and all of those things actually made the world and my connection to it deeper for me, which I didn't expect necessarily.
So interesting. So, okay, I have ideas, but I guess my other question for you is like, what is one of the poems, or what are a couple of the poems in the book to you that feel like they have that permeability in the poem, and it feels important to you?
Yeah. I think that, here's a poem that I feel like there was a moment where I was also kind of working, and this may or may not make sense, against a sort of the summing up, right? And I think it's very easy for any of us, as poets, as writers, as people, to kind of be like, this is who I am, this is what I do, this is what happened. I mean, that's what is required of us. That's asked of us, of the world. And so I was in the kitchen one morning and I had this experience where the image of my stepmother swimming came to me, and I really didn't know why it was coming. And then I really questioned it. I couldn't end the poem. I couldn't figure out how to end the poem. And then I realized what it was. And it was, it was the idea of being witnessed, witnessing and being witnessed. It's that reciprocal relationship. Open water. It does no good to trick and weave and lose the other ghosts, to shove the buried deeper into the sandy loam, the riverine silt. Still you come, my faithful one. The sound of a body so persistent in water, I cannot tell if it is a wave or you moving through. A month before you died, you wrote a letter to old friends saying you swam with a pod of dolphins in open water, saying goodbye. But what you told me most about was the eye, that enormous reckoning eye of an unknown fish that passed you during that last-ditch defiant swim. On the shore, you described the fish as nothing you'd seen before, a blue-gray behemoth moving slowly and enduringly through its deep, fathomless North Pacific waters. That night, I heard more about that fish and that eye than anything else. I don't know why it has come to me this morning. Warm rain and landlocked. I don't deserve the image, but I keep thinking how something saw you. Something was bearing witness to you out there in the ocean where you were no one's mother and no one's wife, but you in your original skin, right before you died, you were beheld. And today, in my kitchen, with you now 10 years gone, I am so happy for you.
You're gonna make me, I should have brought like tissues to this event so that every time the poem makes me weep, I'm okay. I'm not just.
This one makes me weep. It's like
off mascara. Dude. So good.
And I think that poem for me was that moment of really questioning, like, what is it? Why was that so important? Why was it so important to her? And why did in her summing up the letter she wrote to her friends, it was like, I swam with dolphins, right? Because that's what people would recognize. That's what people would know and maybe hold on to, right? But that wasn't the thing she talked about. She talked about being seen by that fish and the way it looked at her and the way they looked at each other and this sort of moving through the water. And I had never written about it, but it had stuck with me for so long. And then, of course, here I am just doing the dishes and I feel it coming to me. And I didn't know how to end that poem, but I kept thinking, oh yeah, like this is the poem. Like it's the idea that she was seen. And that felt so important to her. And again, to be seen by something not human, you know, the non-human animal.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I love the way that the sort of unnamed mythic gods kind of show up. You know, when you don't even know that you need them, you know, and that's one of those moments in that poem. And it's so, you know, you were talking about the title and like the difficulty coming up with the title. I love the title poem, by the way.
Thank you.
It's really fantastic. And I cannot imagine, and I would actually love to hear about it at some point, the amount of like curatorial work into the distillation of that poem from all of the information and like material and even like need that goes into making a poem like that.
Yeah.
But
I think I love that you asked that, because for me, for those of you who haven't read it yet, you can preview it. You can look at it. You can buy the book, but you can also, it's on Rumpus, so you can look at it. It's called The Hurting Kind. And it took me so long to write because it was partly, it's about my grandfather's death. But it's so much more than that. And I realized that what happened was I had basically started a poem that I could never finish. And so I never knew how to end, because I could just be like, well, and then this, and then this, and then this. And I think when you start to remember and you start to really cling and unfold and unravel things, and you start to feel so almost enlivened by memory.
yeah,
I was so attached to it that I couldn't let it go. And so the only way, like, 3 years after it began, I was able to end that poem. And it's a longer poem, which is why I wouldn't read it here, because it would take up the rest of our time and then some. But it would end with, I had to let it basically be like, oh, this is endless, like this. And to admit that the poem is endless was the only way I could get out of the poem, because I was like, this could literally be, 30-page, if not longer, poem.
Well, I mean, but it has, okay, I'm not going to spoiler the ending for people who can go read it on the Rumpus, but the ending makes both the title and the ending of the poem make to me what feel like the sweeping gestures of the collection, right? Is yes and no, right? It's like, and it's, I mean, when I think about The Hurting Kind, like you and I have talked about this a little bit, but I think it does so much work in so many ways for the poems, because The Hurting Kind, in perhaps its like originary concept, is like to be one who hurts, like who is willing or able or perhaps unable not to like experience the sense out of a kind of place of sensitivity, the kind of constant everyday little wounds of the world.
Yeah.
But then there are also ways in which the hurting kind can be someone who does hurt to or upon others. And there are interesting moments of like complicity and self-implication in the book, where the speaker takes on that role in a way that is really often kind of visceral and meaningful. But then there's also just the idea of the way that hurt and kind coexist as sort of foils to each other throughout the poems. Where like the cure for the hurt is the kindness, right? Is tenderness. And in some ways, that tenderness that allows the hurt in is also the source of the healing from it, right? So there are all of these ways in which it becomes this kind of, these two ideas that sort of orbit each other in the book. And to which end, okay, how are we doing for time? Okay, so what I would love to ask you to do, because I think one of the ways that some of that kindness comes into the poems is through humor. And I love the fact in that New York Times piece, I love that Lucas was like, she's the funniest when she's at home talking to the dog, because like, I know that that's true.
That's not me being funny. That's the dog being funny. That's her own personality.
But I love, but there are a couple of poems in here that to me feel really like poignant. There are moments of humor, but also moments of like this kind of sublimity that gets accessed through tenderness. And I'm going to let you pick, but my two favorite poems for this are the Blowing on the Wheel poem and also Hooky. Which I love for the end of that poem as well. So I'm going to let you pick, but both of those to me are poems with a lot of joy, right? And tenderness in them that sort of get at like, what are some of the things that keep us going when sometimes life just makes us feel like an exposed nerve, you know?
Well, I love that you're talking about this, because I really do feel like one of the things, and we've talked about this before, is that there's there are so many bad lovers that get whole books of poems and then we don't write poems for friends, and it seems so strange because it feels like all we should be doing is writing poems for our friends, and then there's like these huge like tomes written for these terrible lovers, and it's like, how is that? Why is that where you wanted to spend your time?
That's
and so I think I'll read they're both poems for friends, but I think I'll read Blowing on the Wheel.
Awesome.
For that reason. And if there are any, and there might be writers or poets in the audience, that's your prompt. And my students who are with us, I've given you that prompt before. I'm like, stop writing about that terrible person you were with. Let's hear about the people who are supporting you right now, keeping you alive.
I love that.
This is a poem for my friends Trish and Heather. Blowing on the Wheel. It's getting late. The lights grayish gold on the hillside, and I'm thinking of car rides from Brooklyn to the Cape, or up to Moon Mountain from the city, or out to Stockbridge that one winter with H and her sister and cousin, and how we called them the Stockbridges. And I accidentally said, have a Norman Mailer Christmas, and not a Norman Rockwell Christmas, and we laughed at how sad a Norman Mailer Christmas would be. Or how, another time, we waited for tea to put our bags in the car, as if she was not just driving, but the driver. Or how, after tea got a ticket on 6 East, she'd go the speed limit, but blow on the steering wheel like it was a sail and say, is the car even on? The three of us, always piling into the back of some cab and deciding what was next, which was never bed, because there was still so much to figure out. And how someone once asked H if we ever ran out of subjects to keep talking about, and of course we wouldn't. We won't. It's endless. Even this is endless. The sky darkening in the way that makes me wish we were wandering right now around New York City somewhere, or at the Governor Bradford and not wandering at all, or just talking or not talking, or being happy or not unhappy. And this is my secret work, to be worthy of you both, and this infinite discourse where everything is interesting because you point it out and say, isn't that interesting? And how mostly we say, remember that time, and we will nod because we do remember that time, except for the few times we've forgotten. Like that one time when H was trying to remind us of something, and when we asked her what, she said, I don't know, but you were there and I was there. And we were.
Oh, so great, Ada. So great. And actually, I think like the timing is perfect. That seems like the right place to end.
Oh, wow.
I think it is, at least on my clock, it's 8:50, which I think that we should.
7:50 if you're in Chicago.
If you're in Chicago. So if people in the audience like have questions, they should go ahead and put it in the chat, and I'll try to keep an eye on it. But if nobody does have questions, I have endless. we can keep talking, but I'll pause for a minute just to see if anybody wants to ask anything. And if people are feeling shy, that is completely fine. I can just keep yapping.
Yeah. I was looking to see. I don't think there's none yet.
None yet, but that's okay. So, okay, well, I've got more. I always have more. So one of the things I love about the poem that you just read is that it sounds to me in some ways like a Frank O'Hara poem. It has that like momentum and that kind of like chattiness. And there's so much in the book that's about inheritance, familial inheritance, and sort of meek shall inherit the earth inheritance, but then also poetic influence. You have a lot of quotes. You have a lot of that great epigraph. And I can see, and you mentioned sort of things that like famous poets have said or old poets have given. And I wondered like who were kind of like your patron saints of poet, like what poets were sort of the patron saints of this book for you?
Yeah, I love that. I think I've always been very suspicious of the idea of that, you know, the artist works alone, that where there's like some sort of like singular brilliance or some like sort of the myth of individualism in general. And I just feel like, no, we work in community. We work in community with all the poetic ancestors that have come before it. And we work in community with all of the people in our lives that help make it possible that we can write poems, all the animals, all the plants, like everything. And so I'm always like, I love that you asked that question, because I do feel like the book is populated with those things, because that is who I am in community with. And I love that you say Frank O'Hara, because I do think that he was a huge influence on me in my graduate school days and now. And the more, yeah, but I think he's fantastic and undersung. And then I would also say in this book, Alejandra Pizarnik, of course, the Argentinian poet who died in 1972. Gabriela Mistral, right? Of course, who actually was one of Neruda's early teachers in Chile. And then I think there was a lot of, you know, there's also songs. There's Leonard Cohen in it. Joan Armatrading is
a poet. Leonard Cohen's really a poet.
Yeah. And so I think there's a lot of influences that sort of surprised me too, like the friends that would pop in, and also just the places, which was always surprising me. Like, oh, Governor Bradford made its way. Of course, Governor Bradford had to be in a poem. I'm sure it's not the first poem that Governor Bradford's been in. We don't know. The bar in Provincetown.
There has to be at least one poem about like drag karaoke.
Yeah, of course.
Someone should write it.
So yeah, and that's a shorter answer, but yeah, looks like we have some.
We do have some questions. This is great. Okay, I'm going to see. So our first question in the chat is from Nicole, which is, how long does it take to write a poem of yours?
Yeah, I probably terrified you with that whole, The Hurting Kind took 3 years, Nicole. That is not usual, although sometimes it does happen. That's a very long poem. But I think that usually what I do is I'll work on a draft and get it to a place within the day, you know, whatever that means, and get it to a place where I can sort of set it aside. And then I will set it aside for sometimes months before I actually look at it and revise it. And then I go in to revise it and sort of tool with it. So I would say it's a month-long process at least. But there are times that poems have come out very fully formed. And those are the days where you think, am I missing something? Because I think it's done. Like, this can't be done. Sanctuary was a poem that came out almost fully done. Actually, my early poem, that's the first poem of Bright Dead Things, How to Triumph Like a Girl, came out almost completely done. I think I changed 2 words in it. So it does happen. And when it does, it's clearly something that's been circling in me for a long time. And then by the time it's come out, I've already crafted it and worked it, and the music is already there, so that it's not just like, oh, it's sort of coming from another place, but it's just been in the body before it went to the page.
There's the quality of like attention in these poems. There's so much of writing a poem that happens so like for so long before you get to the page. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
For sure. Let's see. Okay, they're popping up now. So do you have favorite prompts for yourself?
Yeah. I think one of the ways that I've always started poems or just been curious is that I start to ask myself, like, what's going on? What's going on? What is interesting you? What is an image that keeps popping up in your mind? Like sometimes something is just sort of, there'll be moments where I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't stop thinking about that. And I get annoyed, like, oh, I keep having this thought. I keep having this dream, or that bird keeps showing up, or for some reason this smudge on the wall is annoying me, or whatever it is. And I suddenly realize, like, oh, let me get curious about this. Let me get interested. Let me ask questions about it. And usually when I ask questions about it, something interesting happens. It's not always a poem, but it does allow me to become a more generative space. So it always begins with questions. It begins with wonders. But it sort of is that sort of a check-in. Like, what is it that is you can't kind of get out, right? I mean, there's a poem in here called Privacy, which is about 3 crows. And those 3 crows, I mean, I probably saw them 2 years every single day. I still see them every day for years before the poem came to be. And partly it was like, oh, 3 crows, So it's, to me, it's about what's returning, what's interesting me. And then like, oh, sometimes it's what's bothering me, how do I unravel it? And sometimes it's like, oh, there's something like right now that feels like I'm moving into some kind of new music. And I can feel it in my body. Like there's something that's interesting sonically that feels like, oh, that's a new obsession. I like that word. I like that, the sound of those words together or something. And you hear it somewhere else, or you hear it in a song, or, just someone says something and you think, oh, I love the sonics and how they collide. So it's not always an idea. It's not always a question, but it is the answering. Then the question becomes, why do I like those sounds? What about those sounds do I love? So it's always sort of interrogating the original impulse.
It's almost the way you describe it. It's almost like being sort of like very slightly possessed by something that the poem is a sort of exorcism of. But it's actually that sounds so.
I love it.
Wrong.
Yeah.
It's more like you're kind of like gestating the image, right? Where that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, for me anyway.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, let's see what we got else in here. The question, do poems ever come out perfect without need of revision, you sort of addressed. Oh, here's something. Kelly says, I was at your wonderful reading at Cornell in fall, and you talked about endings and the importance of making a choice. Can you tell us more about the choices in the hurting kind? I was going to ask you about endings, so I'm like really thrilled that question popped up in the chat.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I love this question. Thank you for writing that question. I feel like I am obsessed with endings. As you know, I don't know many poets that actually aren't obsessed with endings. It's just kind of, it's the nature of the job is to become obsessed with endings. But I think for me, there's a huge part of realizing that a lot of times for me, when endings fail in my own poems, is because I'm doing 2 things. And one of them is that I'm summing it up. And I'm basically not trusting the reader enough, or not trusting myself enough. And I'm saying, this thing that I said, you get it, and I just say it again. And that's how I end the poem. Or it's because I'm lying to myself. And that's a big one. And I think it's a big one that we don't talk about that much, but it's becomes this sort of, oh, you want the poem to do a thing. And so you build the poem and then it won't do the thing. And I think the way that the endings can be surprising and fruitful and satisfying as an artist is that you suddenly see that, oh, right, I am at this point, I'm not making the poem. I need to listen to the poem, what the poem is telling me. And then I can receive the ending. Because sometimes we're so hell-bent on crafting and making and controlling that we forget that making the thing is also a reciprocal, to use that word once again, relationship. And at some point, the poem is smarter than you are, or at least for me, that's the case. And so endings for me are incredible, but they feel psychological. They do feel like that, oh, this is the moment in which I am unseated, I think, a little bit from the sort of driver's seat. And I get to sort of be carried along by the language, the rhythm, the music, the images, everything that's come before it. So it's a little bit more of a releasing and a surrendering than I ever would have thought when I first started making poems.
There's so many interesting different kinds of endings in this book, and every one of them feels like I love what you're saying about sort of the ending being really psychological, because that bears out over and over and over again. In the end of Hooky, where you're sitting under the cherry trees, and the end is just pink, 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 pink. It's just like this. It's so perfect, and there's something sort of ecstatic, you know, and so present about it. And then the end of I think it's the poem about your father's mustache. Oh yeah. He's like archaic torso of Apollo, you know, it's like this sort of exploration of this like visual object. And like Rilke, of course, is like, you must change your life. You know, here it's just like, I've always been too attached to the things of the world, right? It's just, it's this like kind of rhapsodic poem that ends on this like really blunt statement, you know, and I think that the different moves your endings make are fascinating, but hearing you talk about it, all of them do feel like there is this surrender.
Yeah.
Ending.
Well, and I love that you say that, because I think that I'm also very wary of doing the same thing with endings. And you know, as many of you guys know, and you know, Rebecca, for sure, that there's this like, there's sometimes you find a thing that works and you're like, I will do this forever. And I know that I do that, and I'm very aware of like, this is my thing. And so I'm always been focused on, you know, how can I make sure that I'm not doing the same thing in every ending. And that has been the sort of releasing a different relationship to the draft that I used to have. Which it wasn't always the case. It wasn't always the case, but now it's the case for me.
I think so. We are currently just 4 minutes over time. So I want to be respectful of everybody's time. But I will say, since we're ending on a note on endings, the end of this book, which is a poem called The End of Poetry, ends again with one of those like one of those gestures of like surrender to the end, which is so fantastic. I will leave it there so that people will go out and buy this amazing book, hopefully. And
thank you so much for this, Rebecca. And I adore you and admire you as a poet and a human being and a friend. And thank you all for being here. We had such a great crowd, almost 130 people. That's amazing. That's amazing.
Events,
questions. And so here's the book. I hope, and also I wanted to say, since we are in this virtual space and it means so much to me to have this be an accessible space, this book is available now as an audiobook. I do read it. So if you want to go onto Audible, you can hear it all. I read the poems. And so it's another version that you can use and explore if you would like.
And you're such a great reader.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you so much for tonight, Rebecca. I owe you one.
Thank you for inviting me. This was fabulous. This was fabulous. You owe me nothing.
Yeah, thank you guys for this conversation. It was so great.
Thank you so much.
Everyone out there. Yeah, I hope everyone out there goes out and buys the book or reads it tonight and have more great conversations about it. Thanks so much for coming, guys. See you later.
Thank you so much.